What are reasons to use SQL Server for PowerOpI? It's complicated. SQL Server handles a larger database size. Access can handle a pretty complex project, but of course there are projects that can overcome it. SQL Server probably runs on a shared server, although it can also run on a desktop. Server capability scales better than a PC. More DDR memory, SSD storage, bigger CPUs, multiple sockets, and so forth. SQL Server supports better distributed use. Access distribution stores files on a server but executes on clients, and not all clients support Access. SQL Server executes as a service on the server. SQL Server is probably supported by IT on a shared server, which removes some of the complexity from users. SQL Server supports T-SQL, a programmable extension of ANSI SQL. SQL Server is more complex to set up, but you do get a bunch more capability, which by the way is also complicated. But you're going to love the capability. You'll need a little SQL capability. You can probably get a long way with the templates I've provided here, but with more SQL you can add more power. Here's the structure of this video. Your data tables need to follow some additional rules. Here are the rules. Then installation, configuration, and security setup for SQL Server and Odbc. Setting up a PowerOpI working path with SQL Server, which includes setting up an entity called a linked server in SQL Server, configured to read Office files via Odbc, creating a connection master template, and creating a working connection from the master template to query Excel via SQL Server using the linked server, using SQL in the connection, and creating a pivot table in Excel using the working connection. Then we'll show how we can use stored procedures called SPs and use queries built and configured in Excel for production work. That includes creating and storing a SQL SP that creates a linked server configured to read an Excel source via Odbc, and executing the SP using an Excel connection. Then creating and storing a SQL SP containing a query that uses the SQL Server linked server to query Excel tables, and executing the SP using an Excel connection. Then building SQL that uses Open Row Set in SQL Server instead of a linked server to query Excel tables, and executing the SQL using an Excel connection. Finally, we'll review SQL Server with Power Query and with Access, which involves building queries to MS Access from Excel using a connection containing SQL, and connecting to SQL Server using Power Query and running select and execute SQL queries from the connection on the way into Excel or to Power BI. Please like the videos here and subscribe to the channel. SQL Server acts differently than MS Access in several ways. Actually, every database has its own personality. Here are some quirks of SQL Server. SQL Server doesn't want tables in a join to have columns with the same column or field name. It's good practice anyway to prefix a field name with a unique abbreviation of the table name. You might have a field named AK element for a field in table allocation, where AK is the abbreviation of the table name. Then you won't have duplicates, and when debugging, you can see clearly where a field came from. The database systems we're discussing all act differently if there are duplicated names among tables in a join. Access adds a table identifier dotted to the field name for the duplicated field, like allocation.element. Power Query prefaces every column identifier with its dotted table name, so there's never a duplicate. SQL Server won't save a query as a view if there's a name duplication within a query. That's one reason to use big queries in SPs rather than linked views. As with Access, Excel structured table names aren't visible to SQL Server. SQL Server can see named ranges, so use the VBA linking code for Excel tables. The code is shown in my video, PowerOpI Structure Part 4 Database Link Tables on this channel, and is available on my website. Finally, data source tables in Excel cannot exist in the same workbook as connections and pivot tables that are driven by SQL Server queries based on those tables. Access and Power Query don't mind, but SQL Server sees both its source and destination open and shows error behavior. So when using SQL Server, put source tables into workbooks that don't contain connections and reports. You'll have to open workbooks containing the tables to update them, then close those workbooks to refresh the pivots and connections, which will be in separate client report workbooks. Now on to SQL Server. SQL Server setup is quite a bit more complicated than MS Access or Power Query. Get your IT involved if you need help. The following steps worked for me installing to my own computer. Maybe SQL Server is available to you already on a server via your company's IT. Check with IT and make sure you have these capabilities. That you have capability to run and log in via SQL Server Management Studio, called Ssms, from your computer to access the SQL Server. Get the name of the server and the SQL Server instance name. It will be something like server name / SQL Server instance name. See if there's a directory you can put files in that can be read by SQL Server. Otherwise, you need some of the security steps coming up. Find out if it has an Odbc driver installed, configured as described below, or that you can set its configuration. Make sure you have permissions that allow you to create a linked server configured for Odbc, and ensure that you are allowed to create a database. If it's available and has those capabilities, you can skip a few steps. It can run on your computer or another PC. Get your IT involved if you need to. I'm installing everything now as 64-bit x64, including Windows 10, Office 365, Visio, Project, and SQL Server. My laptop has Windows 10 x64, but all the tools are 32-bit x86. x86 provides enough virtual memory for a pretty good-sized project, and I've never run out so far, but x64 provides huge virtual memory. By the way, links mentioned in all these videos are available from my website, www.softtoysoftware.com. Softtoy is all one word. In section Programming Projects on page Excel SQL Server. Install SQL Server from www.microsoft.com, menu All Microsoft, Business column, Data Platform, Downloads. You can use the free Express edition available on that page if your solution is less than 10 gigabytes, and most are. Name your instance something like server name / SQL instance name. Install Microsoft Odbc driver for SQL Server. There's a link farther down that Downloads page in the section SQL Server Tools and Connectors. Also install SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS. There's a link also in the section on SQL Server Tools and Connectors. Run SSMS on your computer, and in the connection window set server type equals database engine, server name equals server name / instance, and authentication is Windows authentication. Or IT may give you different credentials to connect to an instance on their server. You have to find the server on the network if SQL Server is not on your own system. Then click Connect, and the structure of SQL Server will show in the Object Explorer pane in SSMS. There's still some security to be set up to be able to read Excel files. Again, get help from your IT if you need it. Here are 3 alternatives. Have IT set up a Windows directory that you can put your files in that can be read and written by SQL Server. Probably they have one already. Second alternative. If you have an Active Directory security group for your PowerOpI users, with permissions read and execute, and list folder contents for a directory, add user ntservice / msql $SQL Express to that group. I'll have a note in just a second about verifying or finding that username. The name of your SQL Server instance follows the $, so string SQL Express in that username may have been replaced by the name of the SQL Server instance. The username SQL Server uses is in the Computer Management app, Services and Applications, Services, with the service named SQL Server instance name in the field Log On As. Groups are shown in the Computer Management app, System Tools, Local Users and Groups. To add the SQL Server login, you can right-click your group and Add to Group, or you can do it from Properties or All Tasks. Third alternative, grant user ntservice / msql $SQL Express permissions for read and execute, and list folder contents for your directory to be used for PowerOpI. This slide page I'm showing lists some extreme steps you could take on your machine if you have full permissions for everything. Then use Ssms to create a database for your project. The database will mostly contain your stored procedures, which we'll refer to as SPs, since your PowerOpI data tables are in Excel. In the Object Explorer pane in Ssms, right-click the folder called Databases, New Database, and then name the database for your project and click OK. Or to use SQL, use Ssms toolbar Query Designer, New Query, and in the Query window, use something like the SQL on this slide with the DB name of your choice. Notice that you have to change the DB name string in 2 places in the SQL to use your chosen DB name, and run the query to create the database. Now to configure the Odbc driver. Nothing fancy here. We just have to configure 4 properties of the Odbc driver before using it. We're calling a system proc called sp_configure, once each for 4 properties, and setting a value for each property named in each call. Here we're just showing the SQL that we'll use from Ssms, and you can execute that from Ssms toolbar Query Designer, New Query, and paste or type in the SQL to the query pane, and execute from toolbar Debug, or right-click in the Open Query pane and execute it. Later, we'll set up stored procedures that contain this SQL and do the work programmatically from Excel. Next, we set up a linked server, which is an object in SQL Server that can be configured to read foreign files. Then we can write queries that use a linked server to read tables from Excel. The linked server can be configured to use the Odbc driver we installed to read Excel files. The linked server contains an @DataSource property for a fully qualified address of the Excel file to be used by this linked server. The linked server can access all the tables in a file, but each linked server can only access one file. SQL Server with Odbc can see Excel named ranges but not structured tables, so remember that the linking code has to be installed on each worksheet in the Excel file containing a table to be used by SQL Server. We could reconfigure a linked server to read different files, but since one query will pull in data from several source tables that could be contained in several different Excel workbook files, we'll set up a linked server for each workbook file containing tables for this project. So adding a table to the project basically means creating a linked server for its workbook file if one doesn't exist, and then using those tables in queries via SQL Server. Here we're just showing the SQL that we'll use from Ssms, and you can execute it from there. Later, we'll set up stored procedures that contain this SQL and do the work programmatically from Excel. We're naming each linked server for the worksheet it's linked to. In this case, the worksheet is bi_linked_tables SQL server.xlsm. So the linked server is named bi_linked_tables SQL server by parameter @server. The other linked server parameters specify that we're using Odbc to read the file and set parameters to read an XLSM file. System proc sp_add_linked_server is called to create the linked server. In Ssms, you can see the linked servers that you set up in the Object Explorer pane with server objects, linked servers. They're in the scope of SQL Server, not within the scope of our project database. You should check that your linked server is working. In the Ssms Object Explorer pane, open Server Objects, Linked Servers, open your linked server name, Catalogs, Default, Tables, and all the named ranges in the linked workbook will be listed. The ones you want will have been named something like range alloc RNG alloc by the VBA linking code you installed to the workbook. When you try to set up the linked server, if you get an error, the Microsoft.ace.oledb.12.0 provider is not registered on the local machine, try installing the Microsoft Access Database Engine 2010 redistributable from www.microsoft.com/en-us/download/details.aspx ID = 13255. The link is available from my website on www.softtoysoftware.com. Softtoy software is all one word. If that doesn't do it, you'll have to get help from IT. You'll need to set up a separate link server for each Excel workbook that contains tables that you'll query. I suggest you name each linked server for the name of the workbook file that you link it to via parameter @dataSource. For this example, all my tables are in this one workbook, so I'm only setting up this one linked server. Once SQL Server is set up, it gets easier and more exciting from here. The OPI SQL Server sequence continues in OPI SQL Server Part 2 Linked Servers. Please subscribe to this channel and like the videos.